Hello, I'm the Dark Master, and welcome back to the Kirby Right Back at Ya Retrospective. In today's installment of the Retrospective, we shall be going over episode 58, eNeMeE Elementary, or as it's known in the Japanese original, Punishment by Monster Teacher! This episode was originally released in Japan on November 23rd, 2002, as the 58th episode. Interestingly, the Japanese name is a parody of the Sailor Moon catchphrase, "In the name of the moon, I'll punish you." I've never watched the anime, so I can't comment any further. And it would see the English dub being released on December 6th, 2003. Without further ado of this sort of pre-review stuff, let's go ahead and start with the review proper of the episode's plot. So, this episode opens to a shot of Kirby, Tuff, Spikehead, and the other campy kids graffitiing the side of one of the castle walls, as we already see the first change between versions. In the Japanese original, the kids are humming the second verse of Kurban Wamaru, which is the ending theme for the Japanese version of Kirby Right Back at Ya from the first episode until episode 72, Waddle While You Work. Kirby also tries to sing along, but due to his nature as a baby, can only say Poyo. In the English dub, this was changed to a completely unique yet mocking song about the king. It sort of goes like, when old Dedede came to town, he got on his throne and his pants fell down, that sort of thing. On one hand, the Japanese original is a nice acknowledgement of something about the anime. On the other hand, the English dub feels more childish, and really, due to the changing of the end credits theme, it wasn't really possible for them to keep it the exact same between versions. So, on one hand, it's a shame it had to happen, but on the other, it's one of those few changes that was sadly inevitable, and admittedly, the English dub does carry the whole childlike tone a bit better. So, the group continue to graffiti, but we then see the king arrive and they run off in fear. The two wander over as Escargoon declares aloud that graffitiing is against the law. The king is mortified upon seeing the doodle of him crying as it's poorly made and insulting. Escargoon laughs at the king's situation, but rapidly changes his mind when he sees his own doodle that is similarly crude and insulting. The children laugh at the pair of goobers. King Dedede, however, has had enough and decides to try and get those kids, but due to his own incompetence, he ends up tripping on some of the scaffolding the kids were using to make his, doodle, leading to a bucket of yellow paint falling upon his head. Escargoon runs over to him concerned while the children continue to laugh at him harder. The king chases after them again, but falls down a pit that the kids had excavated. Escargoon runs over to the king, concerned about him, as the petulant tyrant says they won't get away with this, and we then cut to the jazzy intro. After the jazzy intro plays, we see King Dedede holding up his injured hand to the enemy sales guys. Escargoon explains that they need to be shown a lot more discipline. The enemy sales guy agrees with him and says that they can be quite troublesome, though in the Japanese original, he also takes the opportunity to make fun of the king's lack of intelligence. Escargoon says they want to break the brats, but is concerned about the price. But he's cut off by the king, who says that he has no concerns about the price, as he explains that he needs something to keep those kids in line. The eNeMeE sales guy then suggests the eNeMeE school kit. The king says he's not a teacher, but the eNeMeE sales guy says not to worry about those details, as they can handle it themselves. The king is a bit skeptical, but is convinced after the sales guy uses the old fake scarcity trick where he claims to have one left. Sort of like how some comic stores and just general retail stores will only put like a single item to artificially cause consumers to believe that it's rare and thus taking advantage of them. The king, in the end, decides to accept the deal and downloads it via the power of reused animation. The king watches as the salesman says the punks won't know what hit him. We then cut to the next day as we see there's a newly built school. We see the kids running to the school followed by their parents. It's implied, and in the Japanese original outright stated, to be the first school the area's had, but it sort of contradicts previous episodes where Tough and the Cappy Kids mention that they have homework to do. While yes, it is a bit annoying, it doesn't really negatively impact the episode itself, it just causes a bit of a plot hole. Kind of like how the king suddenly couldn't read in one episode, whereas in previous episodes he could in fact read. You know. That episode, by the way, is a novel approach, which I've already reviewed if you're interested. We then see Escargoon do a commercial for the school, advertising it as a place for children to understand discipline, as we see the people are in a line, as a Waddle Dee is handing out notebooks, textbooks, and Dedede-themed pencil holders. Cutting to Tiff's family room, we see Cerebrum saying in reaction that they'll have to enroll Tiff and Tough in the school. Tough is resistant to the idea, and Tiff points out how it could easily be one of the king's schemes. Her mother, Ladylike, however, says that some of their adult friends will be teaching instead of just the king, with Sir Ibram saying that it's important for someone of his position to ensure education for his children, which does show how much he cares, even if he's a bit empty-headed at times. Despite this, Tiff remains skeptical of the King's School. We then cut to the first day of school, which in the Japanese original is called Dedede Imperial University Affiliated Elementary School, or Dedede's Academy for short. Whereas in the English dub it was changed to eNeMeE Academy, and honestly I kind of like that more. Escargoon announces himself as the vice principal of the school and hands the mic to the principal, King Dedede, who then discusses the basic rules like, hall passes and homework. Interestingly, if you pay attention, you'll notice that everyone is wearing the robes they did back in episode 38, A Novel Approach, which I reviewed already. In the Japanese original, Tough even comments on this fact explicitly, that the king brushes aside, saying that it's an effective use of resources. This is actually an interesting illusion that gives a justification in-universe for something that only someone who is watching the show would really recognize. For some reason, the English dub saw fit, however, to remove this innocuous reference to a previous episode. It's a darn shame, as I think it was unnecessary to remove, though admittedly the line they replaced it with perfectly was fine and captured the youthful character of Tough and the brutish, arrogant boss-type character that the king is. Regardless, in both versions, after the king answers Tough, we see them have the people sing the anthem of the Dedede Academy, and here we see the next change between versions. In the Japanese original, the anthem is a parody of Agoba Tokoshi, which is a Japanese graduation song that was widespread in Japan and would have been familiar to adults watching the show. It has gone into decline in the post-1990s world as its supposedly antiquated verbiage and social norms of particular note were considered no longer okay. In particular, the anthem twists the original's first line from looking up in reverence to the teacher into the sentence that reads, fanning the air to make it cold. This is due to how in Japan, the verbiage for saying both is nearly identical. Due to this not working in the non-Japanese context, it was changed in the English dub to a much more generic sounding sound about discipline and following rules. Both versions are fine and do what they set out to do, though I have to admit I do appreciate the Japanese's reference a bit more than the more generic English version. In either version, people are shocked by the bad singing. Tiff is unamused, and Escargoon announces the start of classes as Kirby is just happy to be there. We cut to inside the classroom as we see a picture of Principal Dedede stares at the student body. We then see a trio of adults, Gengu, Tuggle, and Gus, are also eager to become students, surprisingly enough. Dedede, who has entered into the room, is surprisingly accepting of this before saying that the number one lesson is to respect the king, who then makes Escargoon class president. Tiff points out how this position isn't really appropriate as he can't become one since he's not a student. The king, however, dismisses her statement, saying of course he can become one, and the people are bemused as Escargoon starts the math lesson as he gets Bookham's wife, Buttercup, to come up, and she's nervous, so he hands her a special hat that is required outfit for teachers. This does relieve Tiff and Tuff, who are happy that the king is not teaching himself, and that she should be nicer than he would be. However, when she puts on the hat, her eyes glow green and she becomes enraged and yells at them to pay attention. This suddenly nasty attitude is noted by Tiff. Honey asks if she can be excused, and Buttercup shoots her down in the most rude manner possible. She then writes down a very easy math question of 1 plus 1, which is 2, by the way, and then asks Iroh, the nervous kid, to answer the question. This fairly easy math question causes him to be a bit nervous, and the teacher even runs over to him and demands an answer. And when he gives an incorrect answer, in the Japanese version, she grabs him and flings him into the air, where he then lands on the king. Tiff calls that out as being insanely cruel, but she dismisses her as saying it's a judo lesson, which Tuff comments sarcastically on. The English dub cuts straight to Tuff saying that she's so mean and scary that Iroh can't even answer. I thought that this scene removal was a real shame as it only watered down the sudden change in the character's attitude. Without it, it's a bit neutered. Tiff challenges the king to answer, and he struggles to do so due to his own stupidity until Escargoon helps him out with a whisper. Then it answers the question as being 2. The teacher then asks a harder question of 678 times 100, which, if you don't know, is 67,800. Tiff tries to answer, but again the king cheats, so obviously that it should be noticed by everyone, but no one else notices, and Tiff is very angry at this. And then Buttercup puts up the hardest question yet, which is 1,627,967 times 3,992,815. She asks Kirby, who, due to being a baby, can only say Poyo and thus can't answer it, even if he did know the answer. She then picks him up and flings him into the wall. Again, this scene was removed for reasons that relate to the fears of promoting child abuse. Much like with the previous scene, its removal greatly hampered what the episode was going for. Tuff asks Escargoon if they will get a recess, but Escargoon tells him to be quiet as he takes off the hat and he introduces their science teacher for the science class, Mayor Len Blustergas. He puts on the hat, and due to being voiced by Mike Pollock, when he turns evil, he just does his Dr. Eggman voice, which honestly is cool and does shock the students. And he then pulls out the equipment for the scientific experiment, and it is here that we see the next change between versions. In the Japanese original, he says the ingredients' names, including sulfur, nitric acid, and charcoal, while the English dub removes this explicit naming of elements. If you know anything about chemicals, you know what can be made with these combination and what will happen. The mayor shows them how to mix them together. Tiff points out how dangerous it is. In the Japanese original, she points out how it creates a type of black gunpowder. As you can see, 4Kids censor this out of fear of violence in television, which is again just another example of the childish censorship done by that company for shows at the time. Mayor Len Blustergas then tells people to put matches on the substance, and, well, BAM! We see that the students have small explosions in their face, except luckily for Tiff, as she avoids it. The experiments become even more unhinged as he plans to split plutonium, which, if you don't know, would have vaporized the entire school. Tiff saves everyone by bashing the school equipment, which somehow Escargoon has access to. Despite saving all their lives, Escargoon says that she needs a timeout, and the king says to Len Blustergas that he should punish her, and the mayor agrees, and she is forced to stand outside the room while holding a massive water bucket. The class comes to an end as the mayor returns to normal, saying that teaching was exciting. Escargoon says it's lunchtime, and we see Kawasaki is the chef, much to the chagrin of everyone, even if I always thought his food looked delicious. Tiff and Tuff discuss how everyone is acting so strange as Kawasaki gives Kirby food. Tuff says that everyone is acting deranged except for Kawasaki, and Tiff says something strange is going on and that she'll have to figure out what it is. We then cut to after lunch as we see a history class taking place, headed by Professor Curio. He then starts by picking up an artifact and out of nowhere destroying it, which is quite the strange thing for him to do. He then says that while it is considered part of an ancient Cappy civilization, in truth it never existed and it's all hogwash. Tiff confronts him, asking about all the artifacts he's found, but he says that they're actually from the Dedede dynasty. Which, if you don't know, this is a subtle callback to Episode 8, Curio's Curious Discovery, which I have already reviewed if you're interested. It's a neat callback and shows some good continuity in the series, while still maintaining a level of episodic behavior. Resuming with the plot, he tells Tiff to face the fact that the king's ancestors have ruled for thousands of years and tells her to look in the textbook. She looks at it and says it's all lies, and as he goes to threaten her, the class ends and Escargoon announces that they will now get to leave for physical education as he removes the Curio's hat. The students rush out to be free from the hellish classroom, but suddenly large electric fences emerge from the ground, much to everyone's chagrin. Tiff asks what the deal with the fence is, and Escargoon explains that it's in case one of the little angels decides to run off, and just to keep them safe in general. The king gloats that even if they try, they won't get far, and the two adults laugh at the kids' expense. Tiff asks who the teacher is, and Escargoon says it will be Melman the mailman. The kids laugh, thinking that due to his advanced age, he won't be able to be quite as cruel, but upon donning the hat, the old man becomes just as cruel and attacks the class with a whip. He then tells them to run 100 laps as we see a montage of movement and exercises even healthy adults would struggle with, including running, crawling on the ground, going over wooden barriers, struggling under nets, and doing some bungee cord jumping. It's horrible, and Tiff is horrified and says that this must stop. Melman tells her to be quiet and tells her to run 10 more laps. Tiff says that he can't just treat people like this. He counters by saying that she is ruining everyone's fun. She looks to her fellow students for support, but Melman intimidates them into saying that they are having fun. Tiff tries to speak up, but again, Melman demands her to be silent! As punishment for a rude, non-team player behavior, in quotes, he gives them all homework, punishing the group for the behaviors of a single person. Tiff says that this is unfair, as he should only be punishing her. But Escargoon points out that they have a policy of one rotten apple spoils the whole batch. Tuff gets angry at his sister for getting them all in trouble, and the class ends, and Melman is so tired he just stops. We then cut to that night as we see Tuff and Tiff dealing with literal stacks of homework. Tiff reads a question, and it's all just pro-Dedede propaganda. Their parents leave them to their work, and Kirby looks at the homework confused. Tiff tells them that they don't have to do their homework, but Tuff says that the teacher scares him and he wants to do it. We then cut to outside as we see the king and Escargoon enjoying the peaceful quiet while playing some golf. The two laugh at how the brats are buried under homework and how they are better finish it, as Buttercups has quite some temper. Tiff and Kirby are listening in on the two goobers from out of sight and decide to investigate this whole situation. Tiff and Kirby then enter into the king's throne room and see all the leftover debris you see from when they were building the school. Meta Knight then suddenly arrives and points out a book. It is here we see the next change between versions. In the Japanese original, this manual for school has the English word manual on the cover. Whereas, despite being perfectly fine English, the four kids decided to airbrush it out, even though it had absolutely no grammatical errors. And while it doesn't really impact the story at all, it's just one of those small, random changes that was just pointless and seemed like a waste of time and effort. And it's just stupid. We then cut to that night as we see Kirby dozing in bed as Tiff reads the manual. It is here that we see the next change between versions. In the Japanese original, due to being so tired, Tiff glosses over it, whereas in the English dub, they change it to her actually reading out the part about the hat. And this kind of ruins the point of the scene, and it's just one of those scenes that is mangled by four kids' exact verbiage choices. I mean, the whole point is that she's doing research, and while she doesn't pay attention, it sows the seeds for what's going to happen. But four kids just blusters it completely. The next day, we see the kids have fallen in line and are singing the Dedede anthem. It's sad. We see that today's class is one of music, being headed by Chief Bookums of all people, even though he admits to being tone deaf before he puts the hat on. He puts on the hat and, as expected, turns demonic and yells at the class as he goes to Kirby and yells at him to sing Dedede, Dedede. Then Honey, to try and play a better song, starts playing their own song, which is where we see the next change between versions. In the Japanese original, it's a warped version of the Kirby March theme, which is the opening theme for the Japanese original from the first episode up to episode 71, A Whale of a Tale. Chief Bookums gets angry as it's full of dangerous ideas. In the English dub, it's just some of random music that 4Kids uses. It does sound familiar, but I can't place exactly what it's meant to be. If you have an idea, feel free to share. It's just another instance of silly changes that only detract from the episode. Bookums becomes utterly deranged and starts swinging around until his hat falls off and he returns to normal just as the class ends. Escargoon then announces that the next class is in fact art class, which is headed by Mabel. Putting on the hat, she becomes just as cruel as the past teachers. Tiff wonders what the source of all this change is, but is shocked to see her brother making a clay statue of King Dedede. We see that the various students are making depictions of the king in various media like crayons, cardboard, and clay. This shocks Tiff, and the king says it's the spirit of creativity, clearly happy that his ego is getting stroked. Enraged, Tiff destroys her brother's statue due to getting annoyed at the brainwashing. Tuff is fearful due to getting in trouble potentially, and Mabel, angry, goes over to her. Upon grabbing her, Tiff realizes that it's the hat making Mabel and the other teachers demonic. Her brother supports this by pointing out how Kawasaki was the only one who remained normal as he didn't put on the hat. Taking the initiative, Kirby tries to remove the hat. Though successful, he accidentally gets the hat to land on Tiff, who herself becomes demonic, proceeds to jump onto the desk and then begins attacking Kirby with her diminutive frame. The king and Escargoon laugh at the idea of Tiff attacking Kirby, but Tuff, however, goes to help the situation and kicks the hat off Tiff's head, returning the girl back to normal. This was the only time, so far at least, that Tiff would attack Kirby in the anime. This action seems to enrage the hat as it reveals its true monster form. Seeing as it's now relevant, let's talk about the monster of the week for a moment. This is Teacher Creature, named dropped by the king. In terms of design, it is a humanoid anthropomorphized college hat that draws inspiration from the Manchu minority ethnic group found in China, as well as a small population in Japan. Personally, I think the design is good for what it is. Sure, it's maybe a little bit stereotypical, and it's meant to be authoritarian sort of teacher, and I think it does that job really well. And yet here we see the next change between versions. In the Japanese original, there are kanji that read Sparta. This refers to the manga Kekko Kamen, written by Go Nagi, that takes place in a school called Sparta Academy. The English dub airbrushed this texture out, which is a shame, as even though, unless you spoke kanji, you really couldn't understand it, I think that it genuinely improved his design. It's a lot more bland without it, and he's one of the few monsters in the series with a voice. In the Japanese original, he's voiced by Nobuo Tobita, who is the most well-known for voicing Tsunoru from Chibi Naruko-chan. He says the phrase, "It's cool when you wave," which is again a reference to a graduation song I discussed earlier. And he does a fine job in the role, if a bit forgettable. The English dub voice is provided by Greg Abbey under the alias of Frank Frankson, who is most well known for voicing Raphael in 2003 Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle series. He does an alright job, but it's mostly generic grunts, so there's not really much to say about it. Overall, perfectly fine monster. Teacher Creature jumps on Kirby, teaching him a lesson, and then starts beating the poor baby with a whip. Tiff encourages Kirby to try and suck him up, and he tries to, but Teacher Creature is either too big or too strong to do so, and Kirby ends up getting tuckered out, and he can't do it, which Tuff points out. Teacher Creature then hits Kirby so hard he goes straight through the school wall, and holding some chalk, Teacher Creature then proceeds to pelt Kirby with it. He then pelts him with chalkboard erasers, perhaps not the most painful thing out there, but still can hurt. In the end, the children look at him with concern, but Tiff points out how that if Kirby sucks up those weapons, he'll become Fighter Kirby. And on his own, Kirby decides to do so and sucks them up in order to become... Fighter Kirby. I've discussed him previously in 3 episodes. Here Comes the Sun, Monster Management, and Snack Attack Part 2. So watch those if you want more detailed discussion of him, but he made the transition into the anime well, which some would say isn't really saying all that much as the design for Fighter is just a red bandana, but I don't know. Regardless, I think it did well. Resuming with the plot, Tuff cheers Kirby on. Kirby runs at Teacher Creature, who tries to hit him with his whip, but Kirby easily counters with a smash punch, as we see the last change between versions. In the Japanese original, Kirby calls out the names of his attacks as he does them. In the English dub, these are removed, and honestly that is good, because the less Kirby talks, the better, in my opinion. I always consider Kirby to be more of a younger type character. Kirby then does a spin kick, causing the Teacher Creature to be slammed into the wall. Ironic. Before he can recover, Kirby finishes him off with a massive rising break, uppercutting him into the sky. He eventually falls back down and explodes the entire school, vaporizing it and sending the bell flying as everyone cheers. Except for the king, lamenting how the kids will never learn their manners. And so we then cut to a far more nice, down-to-earth teacher being that, of course, Buttercup, now back to normal, commentating in a sort of story manner about how the king's evil was defeated by good. Tiff and Tuff comment on how she is a much better teacher without the hat, and the episode ends with Kirby just being happy. Now that we've concluded the story, let us discuss the positives, negatives, and my final thoughts on this episode. In terms of the positive, let's start right out the gate with the themes of this episode. It's quite clearly a critique of the public school system, and indeed, especially in the Japanese original, there's a lot of social commentary comparing schools and prisons, which in my experience, yes, is quite true. So a lot of times it's just a daycare for some parents who don't really care at all. Not mine, of course. My mom was amazing, but still, it's quite grueling. And the episode highlights this in various ways. There is the outright abuse that the teachers do. There's how certain teachers force other students to gang up on one so that they all fall in line. There's instances of boring work, unruly standards, of punishing an entire group over the actions of a single person, which is and always will be absolute BS. It is completely unfair to blame an entire group for the actions of a single individual. You know, at least in like an academic manner. And also, I thought that Tiff was genuinely a really good character in this one. I mean, she generally likes education, and it's kind of interesting how she has to go against this while dealing with this school to resist the propaganda. Speaking of that, I thought the episode really put that part of the concept of schooling into perspective, as really a lot of times schools will force beliefs onto students that they might not necessarily agree with. You know what's something I find interesting about watching this old TV show is that nowadays people think it's like some sort of alt-right conspiracy that uh, teachers can impact propaganda upon students. But if you look back when this episode was made, people were more willing to acknowledge it. They didn't feel the need to argue against everything and act as if, it's impossible or it's just a conspiracy theory drummed up by people. And that's kind of interesting to go back to a time when people were more than willing to criticize these things that nowadays are kind of just verboten. Returning to the characters, I thought that the scenes with Dedede and Escargoon, or how they maliciously exploit the nepotism and bureaucracy in school systems, was really good and led to quite a few hilarious moments. The various classes show a varied approach to abuse done to students. Speaking of abuse, Creature Teacher was a pretty well made monster and kind of fascinating. I mean, yeah, some would say that he looks a bit stereotypical, but I don't really think that matters because he manages to have somewhat of an impact due to his constant presence, yet not being an active agitator until the very end of the episode. While definitely not the most amazing or even in the higher tier of the anime exclusive monsters Kirby faces, I still think it's a perfectly fine encounter. Speaking of encounters, I thought Fighter Kirby was really well done yet again. And the fact that he was able to so relatively easily beat up Teacher Creature as opposed to the previous encounters Fighter Kirby has, I think it's a nice decision, as it just goes to show that a lot of authoritarians and just people in power are really weak when you directly confront them, and are just exploiting their position to abuse people. And even if it was very brief, I thought that it was quite enjoyable. But with Fighter Kirby, we're going to have to start to discuss the negatives of the episodes, and there are a few. First, a lot of people think that this episode really misrepresents schooling and like attacks public schooling. And yeah, there are going to be 2 episodes in the future that cover this theme again. In fact, it's probably the most prominent of the recurring themes in the series, just given how the 3 episodes are somewhat interesting and are very blunt with it. But I have to be honest, this is a cartoon. Like, of course, in real life, a teacher couldn't pick up a student and, like, fling him into the principal. You know, he couldn't force a girl outside and hold a massive water bucket that's like 10 times their size. And of course, like, if they were making bombs in a classroom, there would be, like, a legal issue. It's exaggerative on purpose, and I think it's silly to complain about it being so. People also complain about how Fighter Kirby seems kind of random since Kirby is sucking up like school supplies. But I would counter that in the Japanese original, Teacher Creature is described as a brawler, meaning that Kirby was copying his technique, not necessarily what exactly he was inhaling. So I think that's kind of fine, frankly. And to me, I thought that Meta Knight's inclusion was really last minute. I mean, you could have easily had Tiff find the book without him, and really nothing would have been lost. So his inclusion just seems very last minute. And the biggest issue I personally have was that some of the censorship seemed really silly. Like the removal of the word manual from the manual for the school manual. Why? Like, that just seems like such a stupid decision. More substantively was the removal of a reference to a past episode, novel approach, which seems very silly since there is already an allusion to another episode later on in the episode, so it doesn't make any sense why they would do this. The only possible justification I've seen is that they wanted to increase the ability to air it out of order, but I don't really think that was necessary. I mean, it was just a small reference. Most people wouldn't even really notice it, and honestly, it's just a shame, quite frankly. Overall, though, this was a good episode. Nothing I would consider top tier, but just a good, solid, medium episode. Worth watching if you're binging the series, as I think you'll enjoy it, but don't feel too bad if you miss out on it. I'm the Dark Master, and join me next time on the Kirby Right Back at Ya Retrospective. If you like this video, consider liking and subscribing. And if you like to support independent creators, consider checking out my brother's book linked in the description. He'll definitely enjoy the support. And as always, have a wonderful day and take care.